I'm Hal Varian, Google's chief economist, and I'm here to introduce Joe Stiglitz. This is a great pleasure because 42 years ago, Joe taught me microeconomics. I did that calculation several times because I couldn't quite believe it was 42 years. I think it's explained by the fact that Joe was a child prodigy. He was 11 then, and I was 9. At least that's the explanation I try to offer myself. And anyway, besides teaching me microeconomics, he's done a few other things, got a Nobel Prize, wrote some of the most outstanding papers in the area, and he's just written a book about the true cost of the Iraq War. I look forward to hearing about it. That's what he's going to talk about today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hal. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here again. And the title of the book, The $3 Trillion War, gives away a lot of what's in the book, but there's a lot more than that. The title says that the war was very expensive, and that's true. In fact, I could have said that there's a one-sentence summary of the book. The economists like to say that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And the corollary of that is there's no such thing as a free war. And the Bush administration tried to persuade the American people that they could have a war for free. Because they were trying to persuade the Americans that they could have a war for free, actually the cost is higher than it otherwise would have been. That some of the accounting gimmicks, which, like the kind of things that have been going on in Wall Street, while they hide the cost in the short run, actually increase the cost in the long run. I'm going to describe some of those things as we go along. When we came out with the hardback version about 6 months ago, as one could imagine, the administration wasn't very enthusiastic about the book. Their first response was a little bit incoherent. What they said is, "What about 9/11, or doesn't your slide rule work that way?" Now, it wasn't a coherent sentence, but we don't expect that from them. But our response was actually very simple. The Iraq War had nothing to do with 9/11. Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan, not in Iraq. It is now in Iraq, but that's because we invited it to come in after we invaded it. So after I think we and other people have effectively refuted that argument. The administration finally came back when they were asked again about our book, said, "Well, war is expensive." And that is true. And this war has been very, very expensive. It is now the second most expensive war in America's history after World War II. It is also the second longest war. Just to put it in proportions, the cost per soldier of this war is $400,000 per troop. Previous wars, adjusted for inflation, the cost was $50,000. So this is about 8 times more. And later on, I'm going to try to explain why this war has been so expensive. But for those interested in money and dollars, this has been a big week. And almost overshadows $3 trillion, but not quite. We're working on it, and maybe in a couple of weeks we'll be up to the $3 trillion bailout. So far, our bailouts are only $900 billion, but we're working on it and getting the number up. But this was also a big week because Congress passed a $600 and I think about $18 billion defense appropriation. Most of which had nothing to do with Iraq. And that's also part of the story. it doesn't have anything officially to do with Iraq, but the cost of our military expenditure beyond Iraq and Afghanistan has increased now more than $500 billion above what it was before. And we have argued that part of this has to do with the Iraq War. Well, let me go back a little bit to the beginning. When we went to war, one of President Bush's economic advisor, Larry Lindsey, said in a rare moment of honesty that this war might cost $100 to $200 billion. And for that rare moment of honesty, he was rewarded by being fired. And Rumsfeld said baloney, and the number the administration came up with was $50 to $60 billion. And those who've been following it know that up front, we are spending that amount every 3 to 4 months. And I say up front because that is the amount that we're officially, openly saying we're spending, but our actual spending, our total cost, will be about twice that month. Is about twice that. We're spending officially about 12, 13 billion a month, but the total costs are more like 25 billion a month. So what I want to do is to try to first explain the difference between what the administration officially says the war cost and the $3 trillion that we say the war cost. And then I'm going to try to say a little bit about why this war is so expensive, and then go on to some other aspects of that our book helped bring to light. Well, as I say, the most obvious aspects of the war are the direct military expenditures, the cost of troops. But there are a lot of expenditures that are not classified as Iraq expenditures, but are clearly related to the war, and hidden in the overall Defense Department budget. And one of the reasons that the Defense Department budget has gone up so much in the last 5 years. An example is the war is not one that it has encouraged a lot of people to volunteer to fight. It's been very hard for the military to recruit. To recruit, it has had to pay higher wages, big bonuses. We're talking, in some cases, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000. And in spite of those, it has had to lower the standards. The fraction of the military the new recruits that are high school graduates is down significantly, and the fraction of those who are convicted felons is up. About almost a fifth are now convicted felons. So they're not really what you would think of as what you would hope are ambassadors of America to Iraq. At least I hope they're not what we think of as our best and brightest. But that's just one example of the ways in which those extra expenditures are not included in the Iraq War. It's only the direct expenditures that we spend there, not the extra cost of recruiting or the recruitment officers. But most of the expenditures that are the difference between the 600, 700, 800 billion that we've already spent and the 3 trillion represent future cost. And these are of a couple kinds. Again, the first is the fact that the war is continuing, and as long as the war is continuing, we're going to have to be spending the 12, 13 billion dollars up front every month, and it keeps going up. In the beginning of the war, it was 4 billion a month, and now it has tripled. But the second part is that we have been using up equipment and ammunition and everything much faster than we've been replacing it. So that the eventually we will have to replace that. It's called the cost of resetting the military back to its pre-war strength. So we are actually less equipped. Almost all the people in the military agree we are less equipped to meet any challenge than we were 5 years ago. Evidence, for instance, when Russia invaded Georgia, it was very clear there was nothing we could do. We did not have the capability of responding. The cost of resetting our military is estimated to be in excess of $200 billion. But the biggest cost that is not in the official accounting are the cost of disability. And to understand what those costs of disability are, one way of thinking about it is to think back on the earlier Gulf War in 1991. That war lasted 100 hours, so it wasn't a very long war. And we are today spending $4.3 billion a year for payment of disability payments, not healthcare costs, but disability payments for those injured in that 100-hour war. We estimate that well over 40% of those of the 1.7 million people who've been deployed to Iraq will come back with disabilities. Many of them will be very badly disabled, disabled for life, and we will have to support them for life and provide health care for them for the rest of their lives. The list of disabilities, lost arms, legs, it is horrendous. It is different from previous wars. Previous wars, the ratio of disabilities to deaths was 2.5 to 1. This war is 15 to 1. It's partly a testimony to modern science, modern medicine, but it has a price tag with it. Since we wrote the first version of the book, data has come out that has suggested that we were vastly conservative. A study by the Rand Corporation, for instance, pointed out that roughly a third of the returning veterans, returning troops, a third, are coming back with what are called invisible wounds. Traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and deep depression. And these are problems that are not easily dealt with, very expensive to deal with. One of the problems with the Bush administration is been trying to hide it, not deal with it by pretending it's not there. So that, as we were writing the book, we kept coming on scandals, things that we found unbelievable. And two of the examples of what we believed were unbelievable are in this area. The first was the number of people who are injured in this war, number of casualties. If you go to their website, it turns out that the amount that they are disclosing and typically reported in the press are about half the total number injured. We working with the veterans organizations. We had to use the Freedom of Information Act to find out the total number, and it's almost twice. And the way they do this is when somebody gets killed, they report that number honestly. It's now over 4,000. But when the deaths, we report whether they are hostile or non-hostile, whatever the source. But on the injuries, they have, for some peculiar reason, well, I know the reason, they want to keep the numbers down, report only hostile injuries. So what that means is the following, for instance. If you have a convoy and the first vehicle in the convoy hits a mine or an explosive device, and somebody gets injured, that's a hostile action. But if the second vehicle crashes into the first vehicle because the first vehicle has exploded, that's an automobile accident. That won't show up in the data. As another example, take a helicopter. It's too dangerous to fly the helicopter during the day, so they fly at night. And you fly at night, the higher probability of Crashing. Well, if it crashes at night, that's just another accident. So that's not reported in that website that you'll turn to that gives, and which the reporters use for reporting the number of injuries. So the number of injuries now is around 70,000. And that doesn't include these invisible wounds that I mentioned before. The second scandal that you know, is again hard to believe is that the Bush administration has not provided money for the Veterans Administration to do what it's supposed to do, which is provide health care for the returning troops. As late as 2005, 2006, the appropriations to the Veterans Administration was based on data for 2002 before the war, as if the war resulted in no injuries. The result of that is that the returning veterans, having fought one battle, now have to fight another battle. They have to fight the battle with the bureaucracy to get the benefits to which they're entitled. They have to wait months. And in some cases, it's just very difficult. Those who are well enough off, whose parents are well enough off, their parents go and buy it for them and pay privately. So it saves the military some money. People buy private health care. But it doesn't save society resources. Those resources have to be spent. As many of you may know, studies of homelessness in the United States, a disproportionate number of the homeless people are Vietnam veterans. And they're people who suffered from PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, in the Vietnam War. And all the experts say that we are now in the process of creating a new generation of homelessness. And that if we don't provide adequate mental health care for these returning troops in a reasonable amount of time, we will have large numbers of people in the future being homeless. There's one more category of dollar cost, which are the interest payment. And this war is unique in the history of the United States, probably in the annals of war in general, that when we went to war, we had a very large deficit, and yet the president decided to give a tax cut to upper-income Americans just a couple months after the war. And that has meant that this war has been put entirely on the credit card. It has contributed to the mountain of debt, which is at the core of the problem that our country is facing today. It's like buying a car when you borrow everything. You have to pay for the car, but then you have to pay for the interest, and you have to pay for the interest on the interest. And so the total cost is going to be a multiple of the original cost. And it was all part of this strategy of trying to tell the American people that you could have your cake and eat it too. There was no guns and butter trade-off. You could have a war for free. We could go to war. You could have your consumption binge. We could have both. In previous wars, when we asked young men and women to risk their lives, there was a sense of shared sacrifice. You would say to the people who couldn't fight, the form your sacrifice will take is an economic sacrifice, higher taxes. But the sacrifice that President Bush asked for was that they should go to the shopping mall to support the economy. So that accounts for the mountain of debt. It's also, interestingly, the first time since the Revolutionary War that we have had to rely, to the extent that we have, on foreigners to finance the war. So about over 40% of what we have borrowed has been from abroad. And for an obvious reason, Americans are not saving. Household savings rate in the United States is down essentially to 0.6%. So there is no savings, and so we had no other place to turn but foreigners. Well, these are the budgetary costs, and no matter how you slice it, these budgetary costs by themselves come to $2 to $3 trillion. And so, in fact, when people say, how do you get this large number, it's actually just a simple matter of arithmetic. But our book is not just concerned with the budgetary cost. It's also concerned with the cost of the economy that go beyond the budget. And these are of two kinds, the microeconomic cost and the macroeconomic cost. And let me just very briefly try to explain what those are. The microeconomic costs let me give you some examples. When somebody gets, one of our soldiers gets killed, if he hasn't bought life insurance, he gets what is called a death gratuity of $100,000. That's the total budgetary cost. That's what shows up as the cost to the budget of one of the more than 4,000 people who have died. But the cost to our society is obviously much greater. The lost productivity, we're not talking about the emotional cost, the cost of the family, to his children, to his parents, to his siblings, but we're just talking about the economic cost. It's an unpleasant task, but economists all the time have to engage in the task of valuing life. We have environmental regulation, automobile safety regulation, a highway safety regulation. There's a cost. And the government says, if you're going to have a regulation that has a cost, you have to assess the benefit. And the benefit includes the number of lives that are saved. If we have less arsenic in the water, it's more expensive, but fewer people are going to die. But then the question is, what is the value of life? In terms of loss output and other measures of value of life. And the government and private sector use numbers anywhere between $7 million per life and $20 million a life. So this is a standard procedure that is used all the time. It's called the value of a statistical life, VSL. And that's what we use. In our book, we use the number that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, uses of $7.2 million. But the important point I want to stress is 7.2 million is a lot more than 100,000. So the 100,000 is the budgetary cost. This number around 7 million could be 20 million, but in any case, much larger, is the cost to our society, the cost to our economy. As another example, when somebody gets injured, and as I said, a lot of people have come back very seriously injured. And about 20% of the families in which somebody is seriously injured, somebody in the family has to give up a job to take care of them. They require full-time care. I mean, that's how bad a lot of these injuries are. Well, that's a cost to our economy. They're providing care to their family, but they're not part of our labor force anymore. And so that's another cost to our economy that we calculate. There are a lot of other costs to our economy that are harder to quantify and that are not in the $3 trillion, 4 trillion, 5 trillion. In the book we talk about these, and one of the reasons why we believe our numbers are very conservative is that there are lots of numbers that are hard to quantify that we've not included. We've only included the things that are relatively easy to quantify in standard approaches. So those are the microeconomics, the cost to the families. There are also costs, when we had our National Guard, which thought they were a National Guard but have turned into an international brigade fighting in Iraq. They weren't in New Orleans to deal with the problem of Hurricane Katrina. And that losses were greater, same thing in Iowa. So those are all the costs that we face as a society because we're fighting Iraq war. But then there are the macroeconomic costs. And these are very large. And one of the things that we've tried to do in our book is to link the economy's current economic problems with the war. To some extent, I don't want to overstate this, but to some extent, there aren't two issues in this campaign. There's really one issue. The war is part of the economic issue. And let me try to illustrate two of the key links between the war on the one hand and our economic trauma on the other. the first link was even made by Bush's economic advisor, Ben Bernanke, who is now the head of the Fed, when asked to comment on the difference between 2001, the last recession, and 2007-8, which is our current economic downturn. He said that the very big difference is that in 2001, we had a 2% of GDP surplus. We had a pile of money to deal with the problem, to help, even though the problem wasn't as bad, we had a pile of money to help stimulate the economy, and we used it. We didn't use it well, but it was used. But in 2007, 2008, we don't have a pile of money, we have a pile of debt. And part of that debt is the debt related to the war, a large part of it. So our national deficit, our federal deficit in 2008, 2009 is expected to reach an all-time high. The federal deficit, not including the bailouts that happened this week and the last few weeks, not including that. I mean, that would put it over the top. But not including that, our deficit is expected to be $0.5 trillion. Now, these numbers are so mind-boggling, it's hard to comprehend. I want to spend a minute on what they mean. But that is the national deficit. To put these numbers in a frame them a little bit differently, when President Bush became the president, our national debt, that is the total amount that we owed, was about $5.7 trillion. As he leaves, it's around 9.3. It would have been $9.3 trillion, but for the bailouts. But once we include the bailouts and the fact that with the nationalization, socialization, whatever word you want to do, of Fannie Mae, Fannie Mac, and including their debt on the books as the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and the IMF says you should, the national debt is not 9.3 trillion, but closer to 14 to 15 trillion dollars. So it's a remarkable achievement. There was an interesting article, op-ed in the Los Angeles Times yesterday by somebody pretending to write from the World Bank, where I used to work, saying welcoming the United States to the less developed countries of the world, and said it's a remarkable achievement that it normally takes decades and decades. The process of decline. Argentina was one of the 6 wealthiest countries at the beginning of the last century, and it took it about 50 years to decline. That we have accomplished in 8 years what took other countries decades to accomplish. And then it went on to describe the virtues of being a poor, badly governed, non-transparent country. Point is that the first point is that the link is that we have less room for maneuver to deal with our very big economic problems. When in February the government finally got around to giving a stimulus package, the size of it was much too small. And one of the reasons it was so small was the looming deficit. And so our hands are partially tied. They're not so tied that we can't, we continue to spend, but they still act as a constraining force. The second is a more direct link, but more complicated link. And I want to try to explain how the war itself has contributed to getting us in the mess in the first place. And the link, one part of that link is that the war played a very big role in the rise of the oil prices. The oil price is hard to remember, but back in 2003, before the war, the price of oil was $23 a barrel. And futures markets expected that it's remained there for another decade at least. What they thought, they understood that there would be an increase in demand from China, emerging markets, even the United States and Europe. But what they thought that was that there would be a concomitant increase in supply, especially from the low-cost provider in the Middle East. And the war upset that equation. The demand kept going, but the supply didn't keep up. And prices went from 25 to 40 to 50 to 100, up to 140, back now to 93. But that caused a significant economic problem. Now, back in the 70s, when oil prices shot up like this, most of the countries around the world, most of the regions around the world went into a recession. It was a period of stagflation. There was one region that avoided that, and it did it very much in the same way that the U.S. did, and I'll come back to that in a second. If you looked at the data, as we analyzed it in our book, it would have seemed that as we were spending so much money in Kuwait, Iraq, buying oil, not in Iraq, but in Saudi Arabia, other oil exporting countries, we're spending so much money buying oil, it should have dampened our economy. After all, that money that we're spending abroad isn't money to spend at home, and that should weaken the economy. You know, just the level of aggregate demand was reduced. But you didn't see it in the data. Well, some people said we were living in a new economy, that we've repealed the old laws of economics. But whenever anybody says that to you, you should be suspicious. It's a little harder to repeal the laws of economics. You can ignore them, you can't repeal them. Well, what was going on was pretty transparent. What the Fed did was, seeing that the economy was weak, let loose a flood of liquidity and lax regulation. It replaced the tech bubble with a housing bubble. Housing prices soared. People didn't engage in real investment with the low interest rates. They didn't build factories, a few things like Google, but mostly it wasn't things like this. What they did is took money out of their houses. The mortgage equity withdrawals in 1 year was $950 billion, and most of that was consumed. Some housing was constructed beyond people's ability to pay. So we had a housing bubble and a consumption boom, and it worked in a short-sighted sense. As I say, savings in the United States plummeted to zero. So we kept our economy going by having a big party. And we spent and spent, and we offset what we were spending abroad on oil by spending so much all over, in total. And so as a result of that, we avoided the downturn that would have normally been expected from the high oil prices. But it was extraordinarily short-sighted. In effect, we were living on borrowed money and borrowed time, and it was just a matter of time before a day of reckoning was going to come. I think the Bush administration hoped it would happen after November 2008. But as in many other things, things didn't work out just as they had planned, and it began to unravel in August 2007. Well, I mentioned a moment ago that there was one part of the world that had avoided the pitfall, the problems of the 70s, the oil shock of the 70s, and that was Latin America. And how had it done it? By borrowing and borrowing. And so in the 70s, they too had a consumption binge. But then what happened, those of you who haven't followed the history, what happened is they couldn't pay back the debt. And they had what is called the lost decade of the 80s, a decade of stagnation caused by their over-indebtedness. So the Bush administration had read the first part of that chapter about how borrowing can get you out of the problems, but hadn't read the second part of the chapter, that borrowing leads to problems down the line. And so it's almost as if we followed that script perfectly. And it worked just like it worked in Latin America, and now it's working again just like it worked in Latin America. We're beginning to pay the price for that heavy level of indebtedness. And so that's where you can see really the link between the Iraq War and our current economic turmoil. Well, I said there are a couple of things I want to do. First I want to say just a word about trillion. Trillion is a big number. Now, I get many of you, I guess, are used to dealing in 10 to the 0, 10 to the 12th kind of thing. So you're used to it. Most of my audiences, people don't think that way. So you have to explain, a trillion is a million. But that still doesn't help very much, other than to say it's a big number. But one of the ways I try to explain it is that is to say we have a new unit of account. You can think about what you could have purchased for an hour of fighting, a day of fighting, a year of fighting, and so forth. So for instance, to give you an example, America is experiencing effectively an epidemic of autism, and we don't know what is causing it, but about 1 out of 150 children is being born autistic. We don't know really what to do about it. But we could double the amount of research we do in autism for 4 hours of fighting. I'll give you another example. The president not long ago vetoed a bill. America is the only of the advanced industrial countries that does not provide health care as a basic right. That 50 million Americans do not have health insurance, and that means if you're one of the children of these families that doesn't have health insurance, you might not get health coverage. And so Congress passed a bill saying that children who don't otherwise have insurance should have health insurance. If you don't get health care when you have an illness when you're a kid, you could have a lifelong scar. It could affect your productivity. So it's actually even you can look at it as an investment. Well, he vetoed it. President Bush vetoed this bill saying we couldn't afford it. And what he was talking about was just a couple of days of fighting of the Iraq War, a few days of fighting. So we have enough money to fight that war, but we don't have enough money to have health care for our children in America. Of course, all of this metric has been changed a little bit by the AIG bailout, because it's about it was about 3% of what it would have cost what the AIG bailout. So another way of thinking about these bailouts is we have enough money to bail out these financial giants of mismanaged risk, but we don't have enough money for our own children. Well, many of you may remember about almost 4 years ago, the president in a State of the Union address said our Social Security system is bankrupt. And if we don't do something about it, our whole country will be bankrupt, our economy will be bankrupt, and we will break the covenant with our elderly. It's a disaster. Well, for approximately 1/6 of the cost of an Iraq war, we could have put our Social Security system on sound financial grounds for the next 50 to 100 years. We could have put that problem aside and say, we'll deal with it in 2060. Well, meanwhile, in the last 5 years, we have created an unfunded entitlement of over $600 billion to care for those who are injured, the disabled in Iraq. So we've created a gap as big as our Social Security gap in the last 5 years as a result of the war. So these are just a few ways of trying to grasp what $3 trillion is. Well, I want to say just a few words also about why this war is so expensive. I already talked about the fact that it's been on debt, the high level of disability. 2 other points why it's so expensive. One of them is this war, in a way, shares something with Wall Street. Bad accounting. In fact, the government uses cash accounting. If any private sector firm used cash accounting, used the accounting system that the government uses, they would be put in prison. It is a very misleading kind of accounting. The difference is the following. In accrual accounting, if you hire somebody and you agree to pay them, say, $100,000 a year, you charge that as a cost, whether you actually have paid him or not. Let's say you don't send him the check. You forgot to send him the check until after the end of the year. It still shows up as a cost this year, whether you pay him or not. In cash accounting, if you say, oh, I'll pay you at the end of the year, into the new year, it doesn't show up in the books at all in the year in which it occurs. Okay? Well, why is that important? Well, if you're trying to hide the cost of the war, you want to get your cash expenditures down, and no one looks at the future expenditures. But the result of that is it's an incentive for penny-wise, pound-foolish strategies that keep your upfront costs down but lead to higher costs. Let me give you one example of this. The administration said at the beginning of the war that they would do anything that our generals said that we needed. Well, again, using the Freedom of Information Act, we discovered that the generals had asked for these special vehicles called MRAP vehicles in the beginning of 2005. These are vehicles that would have allowed people to survive if they are attacked by one of these explosive mines. Okay? And they're old. This is not a new technology. It was a technology that was used in southern Rhodesia 25 years ago. But their vehicles, modern version of these vehicles, are very expensive. Rumsfeld refused to order them because he didn't want the upfront cost to show up. It wasn't until Gates became the Secretary of Defense in 2007, 2 years later, that an order was placed. And meanwhile, literally the estimate is that hundreds of the people who are injured and killed, their lives would have been spared, the injuries would have been much less severe had they spent that money. Now that's an example. Why was he doing it? He was trying to keep the cost down up front, but the total cost may have been much larger, but those were costs that were going to be borne later on in the disability payments. The same thing, when we didn't buy the body armor for our troops in the beginning of the war, and when Rumsfeld was asked about that, he said, you go to war with the armor you have, not the armor you would have wanted. But does anybody really believe that the U.S. entire economy, our industrial establishment, could not have produced body armor if we had ordered it? That we could have done it within a few months. In fact, it was available on the market. Parents who were well enough off were buying it for their children. It was only poor children who weren't troops that were not getting this body armor. So that's one of the reasons why the costs are bad accounting, the bad appropriation processes. We're in the 6th year of the war, and we are still funding the war through emergency appropriations. And why does that make a difference? Well, the regular budgetary process subjects the appropriations to scrutiny, makes sure there's no fraud, that the stuff is needed. The emergency, the president says, we need it today, you don't have time to look at it, you better pass it or you're not supporting our troops. Now you can say it's an emergency because he keeps saying victory's around the corner and he seems surprised when the victory hasn't happened. But we've turned a lot of corner and we're in the 6th year and we are still funding this with emergency appropriations. Again, it drives up the cost. There's another reason why the cost for this war has been very high. This is the first war in America's history that has been privatized. That is to say, we've used outside contractors. We've had to, again, because he's trying to keep the appearance of the war down. We have 140,000 some troops in Iraq, but we have over 100,000 contractors. So the total number is much larger than they claim. And as we're pulling troops out, we're pushing contractors in. So it's all a charade. Now, contractors are expensive. Some of them are very expensive. The contractors, like the security guards, you probably read Blackwater, they get paid a lot more, 2-3 times as much as our our military get paid. But the cost is even more because you have to pay the profits to Blackwater. So the troops don't get, the security guards themselves get more, but the cost is even greater. Now, it's even worse than that. The cost is greater for three other reasons. One of them is it's very bad for the morale. Can you imagine troops doing exactly the same thing that a private contractor is getting, but right next door, but that guy, the contractor, is getting paid 2 or 3 times as much and not subjected to military discipline? It also costs us a lot. I mentioned before that we have to pay big bonuses for reenlistment. Well, we are creating competition to ourselves. When the guys finish their tour of duty, what do? They say, I'd rather work, if I'm going to stay in Iraq, I'd rather get 2 or 3 times the pay. And so what does the military have to do? It has to pay big bonuses to keep them from jumping over to the private contractor. So it costs us again. And finally, it costs us because the objective of the contractors is not to win the war. The objective of the contractors is quite simply to make profits. Their mission is not our mission. And you can see that very clearly. At the beginning of the war, let me just give you one example. At the beginning of the war, we knew militarily we knew we would win. That was not the issue. We spend $1 out of $2 spent in the world on arms. If we, spending $1 out of $2 in arms, fighting a country that had 10 years of an embargo, a country with 10% of the population and 1% of the GDP, if we couldn't win that war, we'd better give up. So we knew we would win the war. The question is, could we win the peace? Could we win the occupation? We knew to win that, we'd have to win the hearts and minds of the people. Right after the invasion, unemployment rate in Iraq soared to 60%. It is well known that if the combination of unemployed young men and arms are an explosive mixture. When I was at the World Bank, this is the standard. We did some work trying to maintain peace, like in the Philippines. I went to Mindanao, up into the mountains. It was the most exciting time. I had like 60 bodyguards around me, with machine guns, and going to talk to the guerrillas to try to get them to lay down their arms and try to create employment for them as an alternative to fighting as a means of living. Well, so we knew we had a long history of this, that we had to create jobs. We failed to secure the arms when we were marching to Baghdad because we were in a rush. So we knew the arms were floating around the country. But then we made a mistake. We hired these contractors. The contractors' job was to minimize their costs, maximize their profits, minimize the cost. The cheapest labor were Nepalese, Filipinos, cheaper than Iraqis. So what did we do? While the 60% unemployment, we started importing, the contractors started importing Nepalese and Filipino contractors, workers. And of course, it generated resentment, it generated anger, and with the unemployed men and the arms, it began the insurgency. That's where the things all started to unravel. And just to put a little footnote on this, we are, in the way we use our contractors, also engendering enormous resentment around the world. I was talking the other day to a member of the Philippines cabinet. They have a member of the cabinet of the government who's assigned to making sure that their that they have a lot of workers, migrant workers, working around the world, and they want to make sure that they're treated well. So they have a special minister who looks after them, and they know that working in Iraq is not the ideal working conditions. In fact, they worry about their workers being kidnapped and all kinds of problems. So they stamp on their passport, not valid for Iraq. They don't want any Filipinos working in Iraq. But then they discovered that there are 7,000 Filipinos working in Iraq, all of whom have to go through U.S. checkpoints. So their view is the U.S. government is complicitous with the contractors in violating Filipino law in allowing these Filipinos to go into work in Iraq? Well, that's an example of the final thing I want to talk about before opening it to question. And that is, as we were writing the book, you know, we began as you might say, green-eyed, shaded economist, and Linda does accounting. She was the chief financial officer of the Department of Commerce. So this began as you might say, a technical economic book. It was a paper presented at the American Economic Association meetings. But as we got into it, we wound up getting involved in what might be described as just investigative reporting. Things that were going on that had not been reported at that time. Many of them have since, partly because of our book. And we kept uncovering things where I would find something and I would ask Linda, this can't be true. I must have misread this. And she would check, and she said, no, you were right. Or she would find something, and literally unbelievable stories. And I just want to share with you a couple of those. I've already given you a couple of examples, like the lying, dishonesty about the number of troops that have been injured. One of the stories, for instance, that has been widely discussed, and that we begin the afterword in this paperback version, is that 18 of our soldiers have been electrocuted taking showers because of faulty electric wiring by our contractors. And no one will take accountability. And they continue, the electrocutions continue after the problem has been discovered. They guess nobody says, well, it's not my job to fix it. And so the process of, you can imagine the mothers who see their children, their sons, electrocuted for absolutely no reason. You know, this another example is that involving actually one AIG. Might as well mention this. The government a long time ago passed a law saying that if the military hires a contractor, the contractor has to provide disability and death benefits for their employees. It's sort of a good employer law. The problem is that the insurance premium for fighting in Iraq is pretty high, okay? So the contractors all come back to the US government and say we can't pay for it. So the Department of Labor pays the premium. So this is a cost that goes in the Department of Labor, not in the Department of Defense, so it doesn't show up in the books. But then we discovered something else, and this is where I say I can't believe this. It turns out, not surprisingly, any of you who've ever tried to collect on an insurance policy know what's the critical thing? The fine print. Well, what is the fine print? The fine print are the exclusions. What are the exclusions? If you are injured or killed in hostile action, it's excluded. Now, what happens if you're in Iraq? Most of the people, the government claims that nobody's getting killed or injured in hostile action, but the insurance claim everybody is killed or injured in hostile action. So AIG is collecting millions and millions of premium, but refusing to pay out any money. And we, the taxpayers, are having to pay out the money for the death benefits and the disability of the contractors because the insurance coverage refuses to pay. And AIG is the big culprit in this story. So while we're bailing out AIG is profiteering, is engaged in war profiteering. Two more stories very briefly. One of them is, actually I could just go on. Let me just give one and then open it up to questions. You probably all know the story of coals in Newcastle, the absurdity of bringing coals to Newcastle. Well, what would be the equivalent thing in Iraq? Sand. We are paying contractors in Kuwait to put sand in sandbags to ship to northern Iraq. Now, you have to say, what's going on here? It's very expensive to ship, by the way, because these trucks are very fuel that could get. Why are we doing it? Well, you may have heard something about the surge and that creating stability in Iraq. That's a bunch of baloney. What is true is the level of violence has gone from a terrible, terrible level to a terrible level. Any other country in the world where 25 people get killed one day, 50 people get killed another day, 10 another day, would be frontline news. But we've become so immune to these stories that it doesn't even get on the front page. It gets buried. Well, it's too dangerous to make sandbags in Iraq. The contractors won't do it. So they insist on filling the sandbags in Kuwait and shipping them to northern Iraq. And it also tells you something about the success of the surge. Well, let me just perhaps conclude by reading just one sentence at the end of the book. Going to war is not to be undertaken lightly. It is an act that should be undertaken with greater sobriety, greater solemnity, greater care, and greater reserve than any other. Stripped of the relentless media and government fanfare, the nationalist flag waving, the reckless bravado, war is about men and women brutally killing and maiming other men and women. The costs live on long after the last shot has been fired. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevin McCurley. I'm a research scientist here. You painted kind of a bleak picture about debt, which I've sort of been aware of since I'm actually one of the old guys here who's approaching Social Security. You might have noticed there's an election coming up. So now that we have all this debt, what advice would you give to either the Obama administration or the McCain administration about dealing with all the debt they're going to face during their term?
Well, the reality is that the debt is so large that it will take years, maybe generations, to deal with. But that means, for instance, you have to be very careful with what you spend and how you spend it. So, a rich country can become poor by squandering its resources, and that's what we've been doing. So let me just give you two examples. One is, I think the war is a drain on our economy. It's bleeding our economy. Our military expenditures are very high, but we're not getting a lot of security for it. We're spending a lot of money on weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist. So we can get more security for less money. But we haven't been willing to engage and say, every other industry we say we have to be efficient. The defense industry, efficiency is put aside. So we have to rethink that as an example. But let me give you one other example. To stimulate the economy, we need to stimulate the economy. No doubt about that. But it makes a difference how we do it. And we have to think about how do we get the most bang for the buck. We will have to increase our deficit to keep our economy going. But there are ways that we can do it that stimulate the economy more and ways that will do it less. The way we did it in the bill that was passed in February of this year was very wasteful. It hasn't worked. As your unemployment rate has continued to go. It just didn't work. It was badly designed. It was obvious. There are better ways of doing it. So the big advice is, as money gets scarcer, you have to be more thoughtful.
Do you feel this is going to be primarily inflationary or deflationary? And if it's the former, is there any way to avoid being just a bigger version of Argentina at this point?
Well, the issue of inflation and deflation is very complicated. As the economy goes into a downturn, there are deflationary pressures. The high price of oil and food is an inflationary pressure. There's one more factor that's very important. Somebody asked the previous question, how do you deal with the huge debt? traditionally, one of the easy ways of dealing with debt is to not renege on the debt, but to decrease the real value of the debt. You owe $100. If you get the price level up, what you have to return for that $100 is a lot less goods. Inflation decreases the real value of what you owe. And most governments have been tempted to use inflation as a hidden way of not repaying debt. I think most people think that would not be a good solution to our problem. But if our debt gets large enough, almost surely there will be pressure to do something along that line. But it's not the best solution. And right now, I think the real focus of our attention is the deflationary pressure of the high unemployment, of the meltdown of our economy.
Thank you for coming. My question is, so there's going to be a lot of people taking responsibility for this, right? And a lot of these supposedly come from Ivy League schools that, like, are taught into the art and history of economics and history itself. And I mean, what are these people thinking?
When you say this, do you mean the war or the economic meltdown?
Both, I guess.
Both. Okay. I think that after the Vietnam War, a book was written called "The Best and the Brightest," assigning blame to the best and brightest, the McNamara's. And this war, it's not the best and brightest that led us to this war. The best and the brightest were saying, this is stupid. So I think you can't blame the elite, the best and the brightest, for this war. This war is really concocted. I won't say about the stupidest and the worst, but it's not something we should be proud of. The financial problems are more complicated, and I think the finance profession has to take some responsibility. But the way I think about it quite often is the following. Many of the people in Wall Street listened to the first half of my lecture. It sounded so good that they ran off to make money before they listened to the second half of the lecture. So in the first half of the lecture on securitization, we explained the advantages of diversification. But then, actually, it was only the first third of the lecture. And then the second third of the lecture, we explained correlation, small probability events, and things like that. They didn't understand that. Their probability theory never went beyond normal distributions. They didn't understand fat-tail distributions. And then the third part of the lecture was about asymmetries of information, that when you securitize, you create a new asymmetry of information. They never understood that. So in a sense, what was really going on was these guys thought they understood economics. They didn't. They listened to a part. They picked up, there's an expression that a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. There was a lot of little knowledge in what went on in Wall Street, and it was very dangerous.
Thank you.
Hi. There was a rumor going around that current administration is going to solve the debt problem by turning on the printing machines basically creating a huge stagflation, and then creating a united currency with Canada and Mexico called Amaro. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't think, it's interesting, all the rumors that are going around. We have some very serious problems, but I don't think that's among the solutions that are really being considered by anybody. It is mind-boggling, some of the solutions that are being proposed. And what concerns me are the solutions that are being thought about by this current administration. Most of them have been in the nature of stopgaps, sort of fighting one fire and then saying, oh, the flame is a little bigger, let's get a little bit bigger fire extinguisher, and then a little bit bigger, let's get a bigger fire extinguisher. They began with Bear Stearns. They took $29 billion of taxpayer money, in effect, bailed it out without getting anything in return. And yet, the shareholders of Bear Stearns walk off with more than $1 billion. You know, this is a strange contract. And the next time, that was small though, compared to what happened in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They first said, we'll give an unlimited check. Thought that would have saved things. No, if you looked at the details, it was very badly designed, didn't work. Then they came up with another bigger bailout for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And then we have the problem of AIG, and then they say, okay, but Lehman Brothers, we're gonna let that one die. So it's all been very ad hoc. They haven't come up with a program that is comprehensive and deep enough, and that means, I think, to really be an effective program, you not only have to provide the finance, you have to think about the underlying forces that are giving rise to it. Underlying force giving rise to it is the foreclosures, the fact that people can't repay their loans. You have to do something about that. And they refuse to talk about the homeowners who are losing their homes as they're bailing out these other. They say, well, we worry about moral hazard. Somehow moral hazard is ignored when it comes to the big bailouts.
On that note, thank you very much for coming.